Lucia Ramos stood frozen in her small quarters, staring at the leather briefcase that had somehow appeared beneath her bed. Her cleaning supplies lay forgotten by the door as she knelt down, hands trembling, and pulled the heavy case into the dim afternoon light streaming through her window. The brass buckles clicked open with a sound that seemed to echo through her chest. What she saw inside made her breath catch in her throat. Stack after stack of crisp bills, bundled so perfectly they looked like something from a movie. More money than she had ever seen in one place. More money than her family had earned in years of backbreaking work. $250,000. The number hit her like a physical blow. This was enough to solve everything. The overdue hospital bills from her mother's final months still haunted her mailbox back home. Her younger brother Matias had been forced to drop out of school because they couldn't afford the fees. The roof of their small house leaked every time storms rolled through their village, and she'd been sending home every spare peso just to keep food on their table. Now, staring at this fortune that had somehow found its way under her bed, intrusive thoughts flooded her mind like water through a broken dam. She could take just a few bundles. Who would notice? She could claim she never saw it, that it wasn't there when she cleaned earlier. She could finally stop lying awake at night, calculating whether to buy groceries or medicine, whether to pay rent or send money home. Her hands moved toward the bills before she caught herself, pulling back as if the money burned. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she closed the case with shaking fingers. The leather felt smooth and expensive under her touch, foreign like everything else in this mansion where she worked. Lucia had been cleaning houses since she was 16, always honest, always careful. But never had honesty felt so costly. Never had doing the right thing meant choosing between integrity and survival. She thought of her father's weathered hands, the way they looked when he worked their small farm before the floods took everything. La honestidad no tiene precio, he used to say. Honesty has no price. But sitting here now, surrounded by wealth beyond comprehension, while her family struggled thousands of miles away, those words felt both precious and painful. Her conscience hung heavier than any security risk. The briefcase sat there on her worn bedsheets, like a test from the universe itself. She knew Señor Aurelio Vargas, her employer of only 2 weeks, was a man who trusted no one. She'd heard the whispers from other staff members about previous employees who had been fired for the smallest infractions, sometimes for things they hadn't even done. Wealthy men like him, they said, always suspected the worst from people like her. But what if this was exactly that, a test? What if he had placed this money here deliberately, waiting to see what she would do? The thought sent ice through her veins, but it also brought a strange kind of clarity. Either way, whether this was a cruel trick or a genuine mistake, she knew what her father would have done. She knew what the woman who raised her to believe in dignity over desperation would choose. Lucia stood up on unsteady legs, smoothing down her simple black dress, the same one she wore every day because it was the only one professional enough for work. She picked up the briefcase, its weight feeling impossible in her arms, and walked toward the door of her quarters. Every step toward Señor Vargas's study felt like walking toward her own judgment. But what she did next would restore a billionaire's faith in humanity and change both their lives forever. The hallway stretched before her, lined with paintings worth more than her village had ever seen, leading toward a choice that would define everything. In that moment, carrying a fortune that could solve every problem her family had ever faced, Lucia Ramos was about to prove that some things truly are priceless. If stories of everyday heroes inspire you, you're in the right place. Stick with us, because this journey is just beginning, and what unfolds next will challenge everything you think you know about wealth, trust, and the power of doing what's right when no one is watching. Aurelio Vargas had built his empire one calculated decision at a time. Rising from a street vendor's son in coastal Colombia to owning shipping lines that connected 3 continents. His name appeared on construction projects that reshaped city skylines, and his philanthropic foundation had funded hospitals across Latin America. Yet for all his achievements, wealth had taught him one brutal lesson. Everyone had a price. The betrayals had come in waves over the decades. His first business partner, someone he'd considered a brother, had siphoned funds while Aurelio traveled, leaving him nearly bankrupt at 28. A trusted accountant had embezzled $500,000, using the money to buy properties under his wife's name. Even his own cousin had sold confidential bidding information to competitors, costing Aurelio contracts worth millions. Each betrayal had added another layer to his defenses. Security cameras monitored every corner of his estate. Background checks went back 3 generations. Employees were rotated frequently to prevent the formation of schemes. For Aurelio, wealth was not just money. It was a fortress that required constant vigilance. The mansion itself reflected this mindset. Perched on 50 acres overlooking the Pacific coast, the estate boasted marble floors imported from Italy, crystal chandeliers that cost more than most people's homes, and walls lined with art collected from galleries in Paris and New York. Motion sensors tracked movement through every hallway, and hidden cameras recorded conversations in rooms where even the most trusted staff members worked. It was a beautiful prison, and Aurelio was both its king and its most isolated prisoner. When his longtime maid, Esperanza, announced her retirement after 30 years of faithful service, Aurelio felt the familiar knot of suspicion in his chest. Esperanza had been the one employee he'd never questioned, never doubted. Her departure left a void that felt like losing family. If Aurelio still believed in such concepts, the hiring process for her replacement became another exercise in calculated paranoia. 47 women applied for the position, each desperate enough to work in the isolated estate for a man known throughout the business world as demanding and cold. Aurelio interviewed them all, studying their faces for tells, their stories for inconsistencies. Lucia Ramos stood apart from the others, not because she was more qualified, but because her desperation felt different, quieter, more dignified. She spoke in careful, measured sentences, her hands folded in her lap despite the obvious wear on her simple black shoes and the small mend in her jacket sleeve that she'd tried to hide. 26 years old, she carried herself like someone who had grown up fast. Both parents lost in floods that had devastated her rural hometown 3 years earlier. A younger brother, Matias, now 17, had been her responsibility ever since. She'd worked as a server in restaurants where customers grabbed at her when she brought their drinks. She'd cleaned office buildings at night, scrubbing toilets for executives who never bothered to learn her name. She'd cared for elderly patients in their homes, helping them bathe and eat while their wealthy children visited once a month out of obligation. During the interview, Aurelio noticed how she looked at everything in his office, not with the calculating eyes of someone pricing objects for theft, but with the wonder of someone who had never seen such luxury. Her gaze lingered on the books that lined his shelves, not the gold paperweights on his desk. "Why do you want this position?" he asked, studying her face. "I need steady work," she answered honestly. "My brother wants to finish school, and my mother's medical bills." She stopped, pressing her lips together as if saying too much might cost her the job. Aurelio appreciated the honesty, even as it confirmed his suspicions. Desperate people made desperate choices. History had taught him that much. "People change when tempted," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "Pardon?" Lucia asked, not understanding. "Nothing," he said, making notes on her application. "You'll start Monday. Esperanza will train you for 2 weeks." As Lucia left his office, walking carefully across the marble floors in her worn shoes, Aurelio watched her reflection in the massive windows that overlooked his gardens. The contrast struck him. This woman who counted pesos while he counted millions, walking through rooms where a single painting cost more than she would earn in a decade. The other staff members had their own opinions about the new hire. Maria, the cook, whispered to the gardener that poor girls from the countryside never lasted long in houses like this. "They see all this wealth," she said while chopping vegetables, "and they start getting ideas. Mark my words, she'll either quit when she realizes she can never have it, or she'll try to take something that isn't hers." The security chief, Roberto, ran background checks that came back clean, but warned Aurelio about the statistical likelihood of theft among domestic workers facing financial pressure. "Single mothers are particularly high risk," he said, sliding a folder across the desk. especially ones with family obligations. These conversations planted seeds in Aurelio's mind. Over the 2 weeks that Esperanza trained Lucia, he watched her work through the security monitors. She cleaned thoroughly, never lingering in rooms where valuables were displayed. She spoke politely to other staff, but didn't try to form friendships that might lead to conspiracies. She worked her shifts and returned to her small quarters, where she video called her brother every evening, helping him with homework in Spanish that carried the accent of rural valleys. Yet Aurelio's paranoia grew stronger, not weaker. Her perfection felt suspicious. Her honesty seemed too practiced. Late at night, sipping brandy in his study, he would review the security footage and wonder what she was really thinking when she dusted his artifacts from pre-Columbian civilizations or organized his library of first edition books. The idea came to him gradually, forming like storm clouds on a clear horizon. If Lucia Ramos was going to reveal her true nature, he needed to create the right conditions. Not a small temptation that could be explained away, but something substantial enough to expose anyone's character completely. He would design what he privately called La Prueba, the test, a scenario so carefully constructed that it would strip away all pretense and show him exactly who Lucia really was beneath her quiet dignity and careful words. After all, everyone broke eventually. Everyone had a price, and Aurelio Vargas was about to discover exactly what hers was. Aurelio spent 3 days perfecting his trap. In his private safe, he counted out exactly $250,000 in mixed denominations, 20s, 50s, hundreds, all genuine bills that he arranged into neat bundles secured with bank bands. The money filled an old leather briefcase that had belonged to his father, a street vendor who would have been horrified to see such an amount used as bait for human character. The briefcase felt substantial in his hands, its worn leather carrying the scent of decades. He tested the weight, the way it would appear if hastily shoved under a bed, calculating the perfect angle that would make it look forgotten rather than planted. Every detail mattered in psychological manipulation. Roberto, his security chief, installed additional micro-cameras in Lucia's quarters while she worked in the main house. The devices were nearly invisible, embedded in what appeared to be electrical outlets and smoke detectors. The feeds would stream directly to a monitor in Aurelio's private office, giving him a perfect view of how his newest employee would react when faced with more money than her family had ever seen. "Are you certain about this amount?" Roberto asked, adjusting the final camera angle. "It's enough to fund retirement for someone in her situation." "That's exactly the point," Aurelio replied, watching the test feeds on his laptop. "If she takes even one bundle, I'll know who she really is." 3 previous maids had failed similar tests, though with smaller sums. Carmen, hired 6 months before Esperanza's retirement, had lasted 4 days before security cameras caught her pocketing jewelry from the guest bedrooms. She'd claimed the earrings fell behind a dresser, and she was keeping them safe, but the footage showed her examining them for several minutes, clearly calculating their value. Before Carmen, there had been Sophia, a middle-aged woman with excellent references who seemed absolutely trustworthy until she began taking small amounts of cash from the petty fund kept in the kitchen. $5 here, $10 there, amounts that might go unnoticed, except Aurelio noticed everything. When confronted, she'd broken down crying about her husband's drinking problem and their mounting debts. Earlier still, Isabella had lasted nearly 3 months before the test of expensive wine bottles in the pantry proved too much. She'd been selling them to a restaurant in town, replacing them with cheaper alternatives that she hoped no one would detect during casual dinners. The scheme was sophisticated enough to impress Aurelio, even as it confirmed his worst assumptions about human nature. Each failure had strengthened his conviction that theft was inevitable when desperate people encountered opportunity. The only variable was time. How long before circumstances pushed them past their breaking point? Now, placing the briefcase carefully under Lucia's bed, Aurelio felt the familiar satisfaction of a controlled experiment beginning. The money was positioned to look accidental but obvious, as if someone had hidden it quickly and forgotten the exact location. A corner of the case remained visible, just enough to catch the eye of anyone cleaning the room thoroughly. She'll find it within 2 days, he told himself, settling into his office chair to review the camera angles one final time. And when she does, I'll finally know whether dignity is just another word for unchallenged virtue. The morning of the test arrived with unseasonable heat that made the mansion's air conditioning work harder than usual. Lucia began her day as always, preparing cleaning supplies in the utility room before starting her rounds through the main house. Aurelio watched her on the hallway cameras, noting how she moved with efficient purpose, never rushing but never wasting time. She cleaned 3 guest bedrooms before returning to her quarters during her afternoon break, exhausted from polishing mirrors and scrubbing bathroom tiles. The temperature outside had climbed past 90 degrees, and even inside the climate-controlled mansion, the work left her shirt clinging to her back with perspiration. Aurelio switched to the camera feed from her room, his fingers drumming against his desk as he watched her enter the small space that served as her private sanctuary. She moved with the wariness of someone who had already worked 8 hours and knew 4 more awaited her before dinner. Setting her cleaning supplies by the door, Lucia sat heavily on her narrow bed, pulling pins from her hair that had been twisted into a tight bun all morning. As she leaned down to untie her shoes, her eyes fell on the corner of leather protruding from beneath the bed frame. Aurelio leaned closer to his monitor, his breath catching as he watched her initial reaction. Confusion crossed her face first, followed by curiosity as she knelt beside the bed and pulled the briefcase into view. The weight stunned her. He could see it in the way her arms adjusted to support something far heavier than expected. Her fingers traced the brass buckles briefly before she opened them, and Aurelio found himself holding his breath despite knowing exactly what she would find inside. When the lid lifted and revealed the money, Lucia's reaction was everything he had anticipated and more. Her hand flew to cover her mouth, eyes widening as she processed the reality of what lay before her. Stack after stack of bills, organized with the precision of bank deposits, representing more wealth than someone in her circumstances had ever encountered. For several long minutes, she simply stared. Aurelio watched her face cycle through emotions, disbelief, wonder, and then something darker as the implications hit her. This money could transform her life completely. Her brother could return to school immediately. The hospital bills that haunted her sleep could disappear with a single phone call. The leaking roof back home could be replaced along with everything else their family had lost in the floods. Through the camera's audio feed, he heard her whisper calculations in Spanish, adding up debts and necessities while staring at their solution. Her hands trembled as she reached toward one of the bundles, then pulled back as if the money burned her fingers. This was the moment Aurelio had orchestrated dozens of times in his mind. The moment when desperation would overcome principles, when survival instincts would silence moral training. He had seen it happen with 3 previous employees, each convinced they were different from the others who had fallen before them. But as Lucia closed the briefcase with shaking hands, something unexpected happened. Instead of looking around for escape routes or checking for cameras, she pressed her palms against her temples and closed her eyes. Her lips moved silently, and Aurelio realized she was repeating something, a prayer or a mantra that seemed to anchor her to something stronger than temptation. La honestidad no tiene precio, she whispered finally, her father's words audible through the sensitive microphones. Honesty has no price. The phrase hit Aurelio like a physical blow. His own father had said something similar decades ago, back when they sold fruit from a cart in Cartagena's old market. Mijo, our reputation is worth more than any sale, the old man would say. Because reputation once lost cannot be bought back at any price. Aurelio had forgotten those words somewhere between his first million and his 10th, trading his father's wisdom for the harsh lessons that wealth and success had taught him. But hearing them now, spoken by a young woman facing the greatest temptation of her life, brought back memories he had buried under years of cynicism. We've all faced moments where integrity was tested. Drop a heart if you can relate. Because what happened next would challenge everything Aurelio thought he knew about human nature, and reveal that sometimes the greatest tests aren't the ones we impose on others, but the ones that expose who we've become ourselves. Lucia sat on her bed staring at the closed briefcase, her mind racing through possibilities she had never allowed herself to consider before. The leather case seemed to pulse with potential, each passing second making the weight of choice heavier on her chest. $250,000. The number kept repeating in her head, transforming from abstract concept into concrete solutions. She could see Matthias clearly in her memory from their last video call. 17 years old, but looking older, his school uniform patched at the elbows because buying a new one meant choosing between textbooks and food. He'd been accepted to study engineering at the regional university, his grades high enough to earn partial scholarship, but even the reduced tuition remained impossible for their family budget. "I can wait another year, Hermana," he had told her during their last conversation, his voice trying to sound mature while his eyes held the disappointment of dreams deferred. "Maybe work construction with Tio Miguel until we save enough." Construction work at 17. Back-breaking labor that would callous his hands and curve his spine before he turned 25. The same cycle of poverty that had claimed their father, their grandfather, generations of men who dreamed of education but settled for survival. The hospital bills from their mother's final months haunted Lucia's sleep. Chemotherapy treatments that gave them hope while emptying their savings. Specialists who spoke in gentle voices about experimental procedures available in the capital. Treatments that cost more than their family earned in 5 years. They had sold their father's tools, their mother's jewelry, even the small plot of land that had fed their family for decades. Still, it hadn't been enough. "Forgive me, Mia," her mother had whispered during those last days, her voice barely audible above the machines keeping her alive. "I'm leaving you with debts instead of inheritance." Lucia had held her mother's hand, feeling how thin it had become, promising that everything would be okay while knowing it was a beautiful lie. The bills kept arriving months after the funeral. Laboratory fees, equipment charges, medications that had prolonged suffering without preventing death. Back home, their house stood testament to their struggles. The roof leaked worse each year, plastic tarps providing temporary protection that never lasted through full storms. During heavy rains, Matthias moved his books and homework to different corners of their single bedroom, chasing dry spots that became increasingly rare. The walls showed water damage that encouraged mold, making his asthma worse during humid months. All of it could be solved by what sat before her now. She could take just half, no, just a third of the money. Enough to pay the medical debts and send Matthias to university while leaving plenty in the briefcase. Who would know the exact amount? Rich men like Senor Vargas probably couldn't even remember how much cash they had lying around. The briefcase might have been forgotten for months, maybe years. Her hands reached toward the clasps again before she caught herself. Her father's voice echoed stronger now, clearer than it had been since his death. "La honestidad no tiene precio, mija." The moment you sacrifice your integrity for money, you become someone else entirely. Someone your family wouldn't recognize. But her family was suffering while she cleaned toilets for a man who spent more on a single dinner than they needed to survive for months. Where was the integrity in letting Matthias sacrifice his future? Where was the honor in watching her mother's medical bills destroy what little they had left? The internal war raged for nearly an hour. Lucia opened the briefcase 3 more times, each occasion making the temptation stronger and her resistance weaker. The money seemed to whisper promises. Freedom from debt, security, the ability to help others instead of always needing help herself. Finally, she stood up on legs that felt disconnected from her body. Her decision crystallized not from strength, but from exhaustion. She was too tired to keep fighting with herself, too worn down by moral arguments that seemed to shift with each desperate rationalization. She would take the briefcase to Senor Vargas and let him decide what it meant. The walk from her quarters to his study felt longer than any journey she had ever taken. Each step echoed against marble floors that reflected her worn shoes and simple uniform. Her palms sweated as she gripped the briefcase handle, its weight now feeling less like money and more like judgment itself. Passing through hallways lined with artwork worth more than her village's annual income, Lucia rehearsed different ways to explain her discovery. Each version sounded suspicious in her head, too innocent, too calculated, too desperate to prove honesty that might already be questioned. Outside Aurelio's study, she heard his voice through the heavy wooden door, speaking rapid Spanish into his phone about shipping schedules and port delays. Business conversations that moved millions of dollars while she stood holding a briefcase that could change her world. She knocked softly, her knuckles barely making sound against the carved wood. "Adelante," came his voice from inside. Lucia entered the opulent study, taking in the leather-bound books, the massive desk carved from a single piece of mahogany, the windows that offered panoramic views of the Pacific Ocean. Aurelio sat behind his desk in an expensive suit, phone pressed to his ear, barely glancing up at her entrance. "Señor Vargas," she began, her voice cracking slightly. She cleared her throat and tried again. "I don't know if this belongs to you, but I found this in my room. It seems important." She placed the briefcase on his desk, her hands shaking enough that the leather scraped against the wood surface. The sound seemed unnaturally loud in the high-ceilinged room. Aurelio's eyes moved from her face to the briefcase, his phone conversation stopping mid-sentence. "I'll call you back," he said into the phone, his voice suddenly sharp with attention. The silence that followed pressed against Lucia like humidity before a storm. Aurelio stared at the briefcase without touching it, his expression unreadable. Seconds stretched into eternity while she waited for him to speak, to explain, to tell her whether she had just saved her job or destroyed it completely. "You opened it?" he asked finally, his voice carrying a tone she couldn't interpret. "Yes, sir," she admitted, her heart hammering so hard she was certain he could hear it. "I needed to know if it was something lost, maybe something dangerous. But I didn't touch anything inside. Everything is exactly as I found it." Aurelio's eyes never left her face, studying her with an intensity that made her skin feel transparent. She had the terrifying sensation that he could read every desperate thought that had crossed her mind during the past hour. Every moment when taking the money had seemed not just reasonable, but necessary. Without speaking, he pressed a button on his desk intercom. "Roberto, please escort Miss Ramos to the garden. I'll join her shortly." The security chief appeared within moments, his expression professionally neutral as he gestured toward the door. Lucia followed him on unsteady legs, convinced she had just witnessed her final moments as an employee of the Vargas estate. As the study door closed behind her, she was certain of only one thing. Her honesty had just cost her the job her family desperately needed, and she might never understand why. The garden where Roberto escorted Lucia felt like a beautiful waiting room for her execution. Manicured hedges formed perfect geometric patterns around marble fountains that sparkled in the afternoon sun, while exotic flowers bloomed in colors she had never seen outside of magazines. The beauty mocked her circumstances, surrounded by paradise while her world collapsed. She sat on a stone bench beneath a flowering jacaranda tree, its purple blossoms dropping hazily onto her black uniform like gentle tears. 2 hours stretched before her, like days, each minute amplifying her certainty that she had made a catastrophic mistake. Her mind replayed every moment since finding the briefcase, searching for signs she had missed. Had it been a test from the beginning? Was Señor Vargas the kind of man who planted traps for his employees, waiting for them to fail? The thought made her stomach turn with a mixture of anger and humiliation. But if it was a test, then she had passed, hadn't she? She had returned the money without taking a single bill. Her hands had trembled with temptation, but her actions had remained clean. Yet here she sat, dismissed like a criminal, while her employer decided her fate in private. Maybe honesty wasn't enough. Maybe the simple act of opening the briefcase had been violation enough in his eyes. Rich people, she had learned, often viewed curiosity from the poor as a form of theft in itself, as if even looking at their wealth without permission crossed some invisible boundary. The worst part was knowing how this would affect Matias. She had called him that morning, promising that this job would finally provide stability for their family. "I'll be able to send more money soon," she had told him, hearing the hope in his voice as he talked about possibly returning to school in the fall. Now she would have to call him tonight with different news, that his sister had lost another job, that their prospects remained as uncertain as ever. Her father's voice haunted her thoughts, but now his wisdom felt like a burden rather than guidance. La honestidad no tiene precio. Easy words to speak when you aren't watching your family struggle, when principles didn't compete directly with survival. She had chosen integrity over immediate relief, and the universe seemed determined to punish her for it. A pair of hummingbirds darted between the flowers near her bench, their movements so quick they seemed to exist in moments rather than time. She envied their simple existence, no moral dilemmas, no impossible choices between right and practical. They simply lived, seeking nectar where they found it, without judging themselves for survival. The sun had moved noticeably across the sky when she finally heard footsteps on the stone pathway. Aurelio approached slowly, his expensive suit now wrinkled from sitting, his usually perfect hair slightly mussed, as if he had been running his fingers through it. His face carried an expression she couldn't read, serious but not angry, thoughtful rather than condemning. He sat beside her on the bench without asking permission, something that surprised her. In her experience, wealthy men maintained distance from their employees, especially when delivering bad news. "Lucia," he began, his voice quieter than she had ever heard it. "I need to tell you something that may be difficult to understand." She braced herself for dismissal, for accusations she couldn't defend against, for the confirmation that honesty was indeed a luxury she couldn't afford. "I left that briefcase intentionally," he said, the words hitting her like cold water. Confusion clouded her thoughts. "I don't understand, senor." "The money, the placement in your room, it was deliberate. A test." He paused, studying her face. "I needed to know whether integrity still exists when temptation burns strongest." The revelation struck her in waves. First came confusion. Why would anyone design such cruelty? Then indignation rose in her chest like fire. "You set me up," she whispered, her voice carrying hurt that cut deeper than anger. "You made me choose between my family's needs and my conscience for your entertainment?" "Not entertainment," Aurelio said quickly. "Protection. Too many people in my life have proved that everyone has a price. Partners who stole millions, employees who took what they thought I wouldn't miss, even family members who saw my success as their opportunity." Lucia stood up, pacing away from the bench as emotions warred within her. Relief that she hadn't lost her job battled with fury at being manipulated. "So you decided to torture me? To make me carry that weight, that temptation, while you watched from your cameras?" "Yes," he admitted, his honesty cutting through her anger more effectively than any excuse could have. "And I was wrong." Those 4 words stopped her pacing. She turned to face him, seeing something in his expression she hadn't noticed before. "Shame. I expected you to take the money," he continued. "Not all of it, probably. Maybe just enough to solve your most pressing problems. That's what happened with the others. They always started small, justified their choices with circumstances I knew nothing about." "Others?" she asked. 3 previous employees. All tested, all failed." He stood now, moving closer but maintaining respectful distance. "I had convinced myself that theft was inevitable, that desperation always overcame principles given enough pressure." Lucia felt her anger shifting into something more complex. "And what changed your mind?" "You did." His voice carried weight she hadn't heard before. "I watched you struggle with that choice for an hour. I saw you open the briefcase multiple times, saw your hands reach for the money, saw you calculate what it could mean for your family. But you didn't take it." He paused, looking out over the gardens that stretched toward the ocean. "Do you know what convinced me I was wrong? It wasn't just that you returned the money. It was that you brought it to me immediately afterward, even knowing it might cost you the job you desperately needed." "I thought it might be yours," she said softly. "Most people would have hidden it, waited to see if anyone asked about missing money. Self-preservation would have demanded keeping quiet until they understood the situation better." He turned back to her. "But you risked everything to do what you believed was right, even when right might have been wrong." The conversation settled between them like dust after a storm. Lucia sat back down on the bench, her legs suddenly unsteady as the implications became clear. "You restored in me a faith I thought I'd lost," Aurelio continued, sitting beside her again. Faith that integrity exists not as a luxury of the comfortable, but as a choice available even to those facing impossible circumstances. For the first time since her parents died, Lucia felt tears of relief rather than grief. The weight she had carried, not just today but for years, seemed to lift slightly from her shoulders. "I've spent decades building walls around my wealth," Aurelio said quietly. "Walls of suspicion, of testing, of assuming the worst about human nature. You proved that sometimes the walls we build to protect us become the prisons that separate us from what makes life valuable." The billionaire looked smaller now, more human than the intimidating figure who had interviewed her week earlier. Success and wealth suddenly seemed less impressive when measured against the courage required to choose honesty over survival. "What happens now?" Lucia asked. "Now I learn from you," he replied. "And you help me remember what my father tried to teach me before I got too rich to listen." If this story is moving you, imagine how much it could inspire others. Hit that like button, because what unfolds next will show how a moment of integrity can transform not just one life, but create ripples that change everything. Both of them thought they knew about wealth, trust, and what it truly means to be rich. Lucia woke before dawn in her small quarters, staring at the ceiling where moonlight filtered through her single window. Sleep had been impossible after yesterday's revelation. Every time she closed her eyes, she replayed the conversation in the garden. Aurelio's confession, his admission of being wrong, the look in his eyes when he spoke about restored faith. She had kept her job. More than that, she had earned something she thought no longer existed in relationships between the wealthy and the working: genuine respect. But doubt crept in with the early morning hours. Perhaps yesterday's emotions had been temporary, a moment of sentiment that daylight would wash away. Rich men, in her experience, often made promises in the heat of feeling that cooler reflection would modify or withdraw entirely. She prepared for her usual duties, half expecting everything to return to the careful distance that had defined their employer-employee relationship. The knock on her door came at 7 o'clock, earlier than Roberto usually summoned staff. She opened it to find not the security chief but Aurelio himself, dressed casually in khakis and a white shirt, looking more like a neighbor than the industrial magnate who owned shipping lines across 3 countries. "Good morning, Lucia," he said, his voice carrying none of yesterday's heaviness. "Would you join me in my study? There are some things we need to discuss." Her stomach tightened with familiar anxiety. Had he reconsidered overnight? Had business advisors convinced him that trusting an employee was foolish, regardless of her honesty? The study looked different in morning light streaming through the tall windows. Less intimidating, more like a library where friends might gather to talk. Aurelio gestured to one of the leather chairs facing his desk, but instead of sitting behind it, he chose the chair beside hers. A small gesture that shifted the entire dynamic. "First," he began, "I want to apologize again for yesterday. The test was cruel, and you deserved better than being manipulated, regardless of my reasons." Lucia nodded, unsure how to respond to an apology from a man who employed her. "Second," he continued, reaching for a folder on his desk, "your employment situation is going to change significantly." Her heart dropped. Here it came, the careful dismissal, probably with severance pay to ease his conscience. "Your salary is being increased to $45,000 annually, effective immediately," he said, watching her face. "That's triple your current wage." The number hit her like physical force. $45,000, more money than her family had earned in the best years before the floods, more than she had imagined possible for cleaning houses and managing household tasks. "I don't understand," she whispered. "You're no longer just my maid, Lucia. I want you to become my steward of trust, someone who helps me remember what's important beyond balance sheets and profit margins." He opened the folder, revealing documents that made her breath catch. "Additionally, I've established a scholarship fund for your brother Matias. Full tuition, books, living expenses, everything he needs to complete his engineering degree." Lucia stared at the papers, her vision blurring as tears gathered. The scholarship documents bore official letterheads from the regional university, amounts that would cover not just tuition but housing, meals, everything that had made higher education impossible for her family. This isn't charity, Aurelio said softly. This is recognition. You proved that integrity exists even under the worst pressure. That lesson is worth more to me than any business deal I've ever negotiated. The emotional crescendo hit her all at once. Yesterday's fear of losing her job, the months of sleepless nights calculating impossible budgets, the years of watching her family struggle while she cleaned other people's homes, all of it collapsed into tears that came from somewhere deeper than gratitude. She wept for her mother, who had died worried about leaving her children with debt instead of inheritance. She cried for her father, whose lessons about honesty had felt like burdens when survival demanded compromise. She sobbed for Matthias, who had been prepared to sacrifice his dreams to help support their family, and for herself, for all the nights she had wondered if doing the right thing was just another form of foolishness. "I can't accept this," she said between tears, even as her heart screamed that she needed to accept it, that her family's future depended on it. "You already earned it," Aurelio replied. "Yesterday, when you chose honesty over desperation, you taught me something I had forgotten, that wealth without character is just expensive emptiness." He handed her a tissue from the box on his desk, waiting patiently while she composed herself enough to speak. "Why?" she asked. "Why do all this for someone who just returned money that wasn't hers to begin with?" "Because you did more than return money. You restored my faith in human nature." He paused, looking out the window at the gardens where they had talked yesterday. "I've spent 20 years building walls around my heart, convincing myself that everyone would betray me if given enough incentive. You proved that assumption wrong." Aurelio stood and walked to the window, his hands clasped behind his back. "Do you know what I realized last night? You weren't the only one being tested yesterday. You tested me too. You tested whether I, with all my wealth and power, still remembered that humanity beats strategy every time." The role reversal struck Lucia as profound. The billionaire learning from the Maid. The powerful man discovering that his strength had made him weak in ways that mattered most. "And what did you discover?" she asked. "That I had almost forgotten who I was before I became wealthy. My father would be ashamed of the man I became. Suspicious, calculating, measuring everyone's worth by their potential to disappoint me." He turned back to her. "You reminded me that trust isn't weakness. It's the foundation of every relationship worth having." Lucia wiped her eyes, beginning to understand the magnitude of what was happening. This wasn't just a job promotion or financial assistance. It was an invitation to partnership with someone who had rediscovered his own humanity. "What exactly would a steward of trust do?" she asked. "Help me remember what matters. When I'm making business decisions, remind me of their human cost. When I'm tempted to test someone's character, suggest I try trusting instead." He smiled, the first genuinely warm expression she had seen from him. "And help me give away money as wisely as I've learned to make it." The transformation felt surreal. 24 hours ago, she had been a maid terrified of losing her job. Now she sat in partnership discussions with one of the region's most successful businessmen, being asked to help guide his philanthropy and conscience. "Your first assignment," Aurelio said, returning to his chair, "is to help me design better ways to evaluate new employees. Ways that don't involve psychological manipulation or assuming the worst about human nature." Lucia laughed, despite her tears, the first genuine laughter she had felt in months. "I think I can help with that." "Good, because I suspect you understand something about character assessment that I've forgotten, that people rise to meet the expectations we set for them, and I've been setting mine far too low." The morning sun filled the study completely now, washing away the shadows where doubt and distrust had lived. In their place sat two people who had found something neither expected, a partnership built on mutual respect, hard-earned trust, and the recognition that integrity truly has no price, because it cannot be purchased, only honored. Lucia's story echoes across countless similar moments happening worldwide, where ordinary people face extraordinary tests of character when no one is watching. Her choice to return that briefcase joins a quiet chorus of integrity that rarely makes headlines, but shapes the foundation of human trust. In Boston, a homeless man named Glenn James discovered a backpack containing $42,000 in cash and traveler's checks. Despite sleeping in doorways and scavenging for food, Glenn walked straight to the nearest police station and turned in every dollar. When news of his honesty spread, complete strangers launched a crowdfunding campaign that raised over $110,000, proving that integrity doesn't just preserve character, it often attracts the very blessings that dishonesty promises but never delivers. Across the globe, domestic workers face similar temptations daily. Housekeepers in Dubai find jewelry forgotten in hotel rooms and return it to the front desk. Nannies in New York discover cash left carelessly in coat pockets and mention it to their employers. Cleaning ladies in London stumble upon expensive watches and deliver them untouched to their owners. These stories rarely receive recognition because honesty, when it works correctly, operates invisibly. The jewelry that doesn't go missing, the money that returns to its proper owner, the trust that remains unbroken. These victories leave no dramatic evidence of their occurrence. Yet they form the quiet backbone of civilized society, proving that character isn't determined by wealth or education, but by choices made in private moments. Lucia understood this truth instinctively. Her father's lessons about honesty having no price weren't philosophical abstractions, but practical wisdom about how communities survive. When neighbors trust each other, when employers can rely on employees, when the vulnerable are protected rather than exploited, these invisible bonds create prosperity that extends far beyond individual bank accounts. In a world obsessed with riches, the real wealth lies in trust earned through consistent character over time. Aurelio's transformation began with recognizing this principle. Within months of Lucia joining his leadership team, his approach to business underwent fundamental changes. Instead of testing employees through elaborate traps, he began investing in their development before expecting their loyalty. Instead of assuming betrayal would come eventually, he created systems that rewarded integrity and made theft unnecessary. His shipping company pioneered profit-sharing programs that gave dock workers and administrative staff stake in the company's success. His construction projects included housing funds for employees, removing the financial desperation that often drove good people toward bad choices. His philanthropic foundation shifted from giving away money at annual galas to creating sustainable opportunities for families like Lucia's, people who needed partnership more than charity. The changes weren't just financial. Aurelio began visiting job sites personally, learning workers' names, understanding their challenges. He discovered that the warehouse supervisor everyone suspected of skimming inventory was actually working 2 additional jobs to pay for his daughter's medical treatments. Instead of firing him for exhaustion-driven mistakes, Aurelio arranged for the company's health insurance to cover specialized care, transforming a potential termination into lifelong loyalty. These stories multiplied throughout his business empire as word spread that the boss had learned to trust first, rather than test constantly. Productivity increased not through surveillance, but through mutual respect. Employee turnover dropped dramatically as people chose to stay with an organization that valued their humanity alongside their contributions. Lucia's evolution from survival to stewardship became central to these transformations. Her background gave her insights that Aurelio's wealth had obscured. She understood which benefits actually helped working families versus which ones looked generous but missed practical needs. She knew the difference between charity that created dependency and investment that enabled independence. Together, they developed employment practices that other companies began adopting, fair wage standards that eliminated the desperation driving workplace theft, educational partnerships that helped employees' children access opportunities previously reserved for the wealthy, healthcare coverage that prevented medical bills from becoming family catastrophes. The ripple effects extended beyond business into their personal lives. Aurelio reconnected with his own family members, choosing to trust their motivations rather than assume hidden agendas. He discovered that his suspicion had been self-fulfilling. People acted greedy around him because he expected greed, creating distance that made genuine relationship impossible. Lucia found herself speaking at conferences about workplace dignity, sharing her story not as testimony to her own virtue, but as evidence that integrity exists everywhere when given space to flourish. Her brother Matthias graduated with honors, eventually starting an engineering firm that prioritized ethical construction practices in communities affected by natural disasters, like the floods that had changed their family's trajectory. Years later, when business journals profiled Aurelio's companies for their exceptional employee loyalty and community impact, the articles rarely mentioned the briefcase test that started everything. The dramatic moment of testing had faded into history, replaced by the quiet daily work of building trust through consistent respect and shared prosperity. This transformation illustrates a profound truth about human nature. Silent choices behind closed doors can echo louder than the grandest announcements made in public. Lucia's decision to return that money created waves that touched hundreds of lives: employees who found dignity in their work, families who escaped poverty through educational opportunities, communities that prospered through ethical business practices. The briefcase full of cash became a symbol not of temptation overcome, but of trust restored. Proof that integrity, once recognized and honored, multiplies beyond any interest rate that money alone could ever generate. 5 years later, Lucia stood in the same study where she had once trembled while confessing her discovery of a briefcase full of cash. But now she reviewed architectural plans for a community center that would bear her mother's name, funded by the Vargas Foundation and designed to provide educational resources for families recovering from natural disasters. The scared young woman who had cleaned these floors while calculating impossible budgets had evolved into a confident leader whose insights shaped philanthropic investments across 3 countries. Her brother Matthias, now a successful engineer, had joined their efforts by developing affordable housing solutions for flood-prone regions, turning their family's tragedy into hope for thousands of others. Aurelio, approaching 70 but more energetic than he had felt in decades, often marveled at how profoundly one moment of honesty had redirected his entire life's trajectory. The walls he had built around his heart, constructed from years of betrayal and disappointment, had crumbled not through force, but through the gentle persistence of earned trust. Their partnership had produced results neither could have achieved alone. The scholarship fund that started with Matthias now supported over 200 students annually. The employee development programs they designed had been adopted by companies throughout Latin America, proving that treating workers with dignity increased both productivity and loyalty. Their housing initiatives had rebuilt entire communities, creating not just shelter, but sustainable economies where families could thrive. But perhaps the most significant transformation remained invisible to outside observers. Aurelio had learned to see people as partners, rather than potential threats, approaching new relationships with curiosity instead of suspicion. Lucia had discovered that integrity doesn't guarantee immediate reward, but it creates foundations upon which lasting prosperity can be built. The briefcase test had revealed something neither expected: that the greatest poverty wasn't lack of money but absence of trust, and the greatest wealth wasn't accumulation of assets but cultivation of character that others could depend upon absolutely. This deeper lesson about integrity being invisible until tested had become central to how they approached both business and life. Character, they learned, operates like healthy circulation, essential for life, but noticed only when it fails. The employees who never stole, the partners who honored agreements, the friends who kept confidences. These quiet examples of integrity formed the foundation that made everything else possible. Their story had inspired changes that extended far beyond their immediate circle. Business schools now taught case studies about building trust-based organizations. Other wealthy individuals had contacted Aurelio, seeking advice about meaningful philanthropy that addressed root causes rather than just symptoms. Young professionals approached Lucia at conferences, asking how to maintain integrity when facing impossible financial pressures. Yet none of this appeared in newspaper headlines or business magazine profiles. The daily work of building trust, one relationship at a time, rarely generated dramatic news coverage. The transformed lives of scholarship recipients, the families lifted from poverty through dignified employment, the communities rebuilt through ethical business practices, These victories accumulated quietly, changing the world one person at a time. Sometimes the greatest triumphs remain untold, tucked inside the hearts of those who chose honesty when no one was watching, who trusted when experience suggested cynicism, who invested in human potential when calculations recommended caution. Lucia's choice to return that briefcase had proven that integrity isn't weakness disguised as virtue. It's strength that creates possibilities where none existed before. Her moment of moral courage hadn't just preserved her character. It had unlocked resources and relationships that transformed multiple generations of her family, while teaching one of the country's most successful businessmen that his greatest success would come through trusting others rather than testing them. The briefcase now sat in Aurelio's personal office, no longer filled with money, but with letters from scholarship recipients, photos from community projects, and thank you notes from families whose lives had been changed through programs that began with one young woman's decision to do what was right despite the cost. Every time doubt crept into his mind about trusting someone new, Aurelio would glance at that empty briefcase and remember that the most valuable things in life, trust, respect, genuine partnership, cannot be bought, only earned through consistent character over time. What would you have done in Lucia's position, facing that briefcase full of cash while your family struggled with overwhelming debt? Share your thoughts below, and if this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Because in a world that often rewards shortcuts and celebrates wealth over character, we need reminders that the greatest victories belong to those who choose integrity when it costs them everything. If stories like this resonate with your heart, you're exactly where you belong. Subscribe to join us as we continue sharing these untold triumphs, the quiet moments of courage that change everything, one honest choice at a time. Because the world needs more heroes like Lucia and more leaders like the man she helped Aurelio become.